Welcome back from the break. I hope you were able to stretch and get some coffee or tea. We will have two additional presentations in this next set before lunch break. Our next presentation is on the modernization of clinical trials through digital health technologies, decentralized clinical trials, and point-of-care trials. Presenting is Ms. Beth Kunkoski, Health Science Policy Analyst, Clinical Methodologies in CDER's Office of Medical Policy. After this, we will hear about PDUFA VII, real-world evidence from Captain Kimberly Smith, who works in real-world evidence analytics in CDER's Office of Medical Policy. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Hello, my name is Beth Kunkoski. I am a Health Science Policy Analyst in CDER's Office of Medical Policy. Today, I will be discussing the modernization of clinical trials through digital health technologies, decentralized clinical trials, and point-of-care trials. All of us are privileged to be participating in a technologic revolution. Technology dominates almost everything we do and has opened all sorts of new opportunities. Information technology knows no geographic limits. Data can be instantaneously transmitted from anywhere in the world. Looking at clinical trials, there are many opportunities to embrace these advances. It's obvious that many of traditional processes in clinical trials can be modernized. Decentralizing activities in clinical trials is not new. Patient diaries, interactive voice response systems, and telephone follow-up have been used in clinical trials for years. COVID-19 changed how we conduct clinical trials. Not having patients travel to trial sites allowed many ongoing trials to continue during the public health emergency. During this time, FDA published a guidance on the conduct of clinical trials during the public health emergency. FDA recently published a draft guidance on decentralized clinical trials for drugs, biological products, and devices. A decentralized clinical trial is a trial where some or all trial-related activities occur at locations other than traditional clinical trial sites. Decentralized clinical trials might involve the use of telehealth visits, digital health technologies, direct distribution of product to participants, use of electronic informed consent, use of home health visits to trial participants, or the use of local healthcare providers and facilities. Why are regulators interested in decentralized clinical trials? To improve patient accessibility, to allow patients with rare diseases or patients with mobility or cognitive challenges to participate, to enhance the diversity of patient populations, to enhance patient convenience, to facilitate trial efficiencies, and to reduce the spread of contagious diseases. One of the first things to consider when conducting a DCT is the design of the DCT itself. We see trial activities potentially occurring at locations such as participants' personal physicians' offices or their home. So when designing the DCT and determining the assessments to be performed, consideration should be given as to whether an assessment should produce similar results regardless of whether it is conducted remotely or at a trial site. For example, if a participant is performing home spirometry, the result of this assessment may differ than if it was performed under the direct supervision of an investigator at a trial site. Further, assessments performed by local healthcare providers as part of routine clinical practice, for example, evaluation of a participant's symptoms, may be more variable and less precise than assessments conducted by trial personnel. This factor also should be considered when designing a DCT. Another consideration for study design as it relates to DCTs is the statistical analysis to be performed. In non-inferiority trials, if the effect size of an active control drug has only been determined in a traditional site-based clinical trial, this may differ in a DCT setting. In addition, as mentioned, the variability and precision of the data obtained in a DCT may differ from that of a traditional site-based clinical trial. This would not affect the validity of a finding of superiority, but it could affect the validity of a finding of non-inferiority. In terms of inspections related to clinical trials, While many locations used in a DCT may be remote, there should be a physical location where all clinical trial-related records for participants under the investigator's care are accessible and where trial personnel can be interviewed. This location will need to be included on Form FDA 1572 for drug trials and in the IDE application for device trials. When conducting a decentralized clinical trial, you may consider remote trial visits. These allow the investigator to oversee trial-related activities at other locations. There may be challenges associated with remote visits, including local regulations on telemedicine, inability to conduct physical examinations. Use of photography may be helpful but also has limitations. Investigators may not have the same relationship with trial participants with the absence of in-person visits. If there are complex drug administration procedures, it could be troublesome. Some investigational products may require close medical supervision in case of adverse effects. DCTs may also allow for home visits. This novel approach extends the physical reach of the trial and enhances convenience for trial participants. This may allow participants that have mobility challenges to still participate in a trial. Either dedicated trial personnel or contracted fee-for-service staff may go to the patient's home or other location of preference to collect trial-related data. Now, there are also mobile trial units that bring a lab to a more rural area to enhance convenience for trial participants. Just like in a traditional site-based clinical trial, in a DCT, the investigator is responsible for the conduct of the trial, and the individual is delegated to perform trial-related activities. A key difference for DCTs is the extent to which the investigator uses telehealth, trial personnel working remotely, local healthcare providers, and/or digital health technologies in the conduct of the trial. Decentralized features may necessitate additional training, coordination, and standard operating procedures to ensure consistent implementation. DCTs may allow for the direct distribution of investigational product to trial participants. In all trials, the investigator must control release of the product to trial participants. Local state laws differ on direct distribution to patients. They may require locally licensed healthcare professionals, such as a pharmacist, to distribute the investigational product. Sponsors must consider the packing, handling, and shipping of product. Another factor that should be described in the protocol is how investigators will track and document that trial participants or legally authorized representatives receive investigational products. Additionally, the protocol should describe the procedures that investigators or participants should use to return or dispose of unused investigational products and how this return or disposal will be documented. Local healthcare providers, such as doctors or nurses, may be used by sponsors or investigators to perform certain trial-related activities. This may be done, for example, on a fee-for-service basis. Again, such local HCPs would not be considered trial personnel. Please note, though, there are certain stipulations regarding the trial-related services local healthcare providers should provide. These services should not differ from those that they are qualified to perform in clinical practice and also should not require a detailed knowledge of the protocol or the investigational product. These services might include, for example, obtaining vital signs or performing a physical exam on a trial participant. If there are activities required by the study protocol that are unique to the research or do require a detailed knowledge of the protocol or the investigational product, these activities should be performed by qualified trial personnel who have been appropriately trained. The idea of allowing local healthcare providers to perform certain trial-related activities that fulfill the criteria just mentioned is that the local healthcare provider would simply be performing tasks no different than what they may perform in the course of their usual practice and which do not require specialized training to perform. Such local healthcare providers are already licensed and regulated in terms of providing such services, and their expertise could be relied upon to support the clinical trial. In terms of delegation of trial-related activities, when permitted by the trial protocol, investigators can delegate trial-related activities to local healthcare providers in order to allow the conduct of activities that require in-person interactions with trial participants. These activities might include a physical exam, drawing blood, taking blood pressure. These activities may occur at a local healthcare facility or at a participant's home. One critical consideration regarding delegation of such trial-related activities to local healthcare providers is the potential for variability in the approach across different practices for certain activities. These might include what data are documented when collecting vital signs, how a physical exam is performed, or how evaluation of adverse events is conducted. In order to help reduce variability in such activities, quality control measures, including regular review by investigators of participant data entered by local healthcare providers, should be performed. This will help in the assessment of the consistency and completeness of the required procedures. The type and scope of quality control measures should be tailored to the criticality of the data and the complexity of procedures done by the local healthcare provider. In addition to delegation of in-person activities to local healthcare providers, investigators may utilize technologies such as video conferencing to allow for direct oversight of trial activities delegated to trial personnel. These might include activities such as fitting of wearable sensors, photographing skin lesions, or possibly conducting physical exams. Investigators conducting drug trials as either traditional or DCTs must complete Form 1572, the Statement of the Investigator. This form includes information such as the name and address of the investigator and the research facility, the name and address of clinical laboratory facilities to be used in the study, and the names of any sub-investigators. In terms of determining when trial personnel should be included as sub-investigators on Form 1572, if they are contributing directly and significantly to the trial data, they should be included as sub-investigators on Form 1572. For further information on completing Form 1572, please see the frequently asked questions on the Statement of the Investigator. Local healthcare providers should not be listed on Form 1572 as sub-investigators. Local healthcare providers should, however, be included in a task log, which we will discuss next. To prepare and maintain adequate case histories, investigators must maintain a task log of local healthcare providers who perform trial-related activities. The task log should include the name and affiliation of the local healthcare provider, a description of their role and assigned tasks, the date these local healthcare providers are added to the log, as well as the locations where these activities are conducted. The task log should be dated and signed by the investigator when it is initially created and updated when a new local healthcare provider is added to the log. The task log should be available to FDA during inspections. Electronic informed consent is fairly common in all clinical trials these days. The regulatory requirements for obtaining informed consent and IRB review do not differ for DCTs. Electronic informed consent allows patients to review and sign documents at their convenience at home. Investigators may provide videos and other graphics to make the process informative and more easily understood. FDA published a guidance on electronic informed consent in 2016. If you would like to learn more about the DCT guidance, please join us on June 20th for a webinar on the guidance. The DCT guidance is a draft guidance. Please submit comments to the docket by August 1st. To test to see what you have learned about investigator responsibilities in a decentralized clinical trial, here is a challenge question. All local healthcare providers participating in a clinical trial would need to be listed on a Form FDA 1572, the Statement of the Investigator. Is this true or false? And the correct answer is false. These could be listed on a task log. Now let's discuss how new technologies have enabled new capabilities in clinical trials. We all recognize the profound impact that new technologies have on our ability to gather clinical data. Computers that formerly occupied entire buildings are now condensed into our cell phones with extraordinary capacities for data storage and analysis. Digital health technologies can transmit data from patients wherever they are, as well as provide opportunities to quantify clinical features more precisely. A digital health technology is a system that uses computing platforms, connectivity, software, and/or sensors for healthcare and related uses. Some common examples include portable sensors such as activity trackers or mobile apps. Digital health technologies allow access to more frequent or continuous data. They have the ability to detect sporadic events that might not be caught in a clinic, such as seizures, arrhythmias, or falls. They can collect patient-reported outcomes, such as ecological momentary assessments. They allow for collection of data in the real-world environment and to record objective functionality. Here are some examples of digital health technologies. Some of them are sensor-based, such as continuous glucose monitors, ECG monitors, or actigraphy. Some DHTs are mobile applications run on smartphones, such as patient-reported outcomes or coordination tests for neurological disorders. FDA published a draft guidance on digital health technologies for remote data acquisition in clinical investigations in December 2021. FDA has been reviewing these docket comments and is working towards finalizing the guidance. Some DHTs meet the definition of a medical device, others do not. This definition is defined in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Acts. I have determined my DHT is a device. Now, do I need pre-market clearance or approval to use the device in a clinical investigation for another medical product? Devices intended only for use in clinical investigations are typically exempt from many requirements applicable to devices, including pre-market clearance or approval, as long as the investigation complies with applicable requirements under 21 CFR Part 812, also known as the IDE regulations. When is an investigational device exemption application to FDA required? For a DHT that is a non-significant risk device, an IDE application to FDA is generally not required. If my DHT is a significant risk device, when all information required in an IDE application is also contained in an IND, FDA generally does not expect sponsors to submit a separate IDE for these clinical investigations. If my DHT is a device used in accordance with its authorized intended use, an IDE application to FDA is generally not required. Here's another challenge question. All digital health technologies need to be cleared or approved to be used in a clinical trial. True or false? False. As we just discussed, not all devices need to be cleared or approved to be used in a clinical trial. When it's time to select a digital health technology for your clinical investigation, it's important to start with some basic fundamental questions of, is the digital health technology comfortable? Is the participant going to put it on and wear it all day? Is it easy to use? Does the battery last as long as possible? What's the process to sync the data to ensure that the sponsor receives all of the data they need for their protocol? Is it a bring your own approach where a participant is using their own digital health technology? After selection of the DHT, it's time to think about verification and validation of the DHT measurement. This is a technology question to evaluate the DHT. How accurate and precise is the DHT in measuring the targeted feature, such as steps or sleep? Does the algorithm used to interpret the raw signal reliably represent the clinical characteristic or event we're trying to measure? Are the data recorded by the DHT and trial participants the same as the data we would report if we were looking directly at the trial participant? Justification of the endpoint is a clinical question about the feature being measured, regardless of the technology used to make that measurement. Is the endpoint a clinically meaningful measurement of drug effects? Usually, comparison with an existing benchmark of performance, such as the UPDRS or other patient-reported outcome or the 6-minute walk distance, is a good way to assess this. Collaboration from many different stakeholders, such as patients, caregivers, physicians, disease experts, and regulators, can help to assess if an endpoint is a clinically meaningful measure. Developing a novel endpoint based on a DHT-derived data can be challenging. First, you have to decide what you're measuring, such as steps. Then you need to define the window of observation and the response that will be seen in each patient. There are many other aspects that should be considered when running a trial using DHTs. There should be trial participant and personnel training. Technical support should be available for their participants and personnel. In addition, there must be a plan to address updates to DHT hardware and software. It is fairly common for security updates to be rolled out regularly, and sponsors must ensure these updates do not impact the integrity of data collected for the trial. 21 CFR Part 11 outlines electronic record protection and retention requirements. When first designing a trial based on DHT data, sponsors should discuss with relevant review divisions the type of data recorded from each participant to be submitted to the FDA for review. The data output of the DHT and its associated metadata should be transmitted from the DHT to a durable electronic data repository. The source data is generally considered the data housed in the durable electronic data repository and not the data stored on individual DHTs. Additional information is available in the newly published draft guidance on Part 11, Electronic Systems, Electronic Records, and Electronic Signatures, Questions and Answers. DHTs may allow us to modernize the performance of trials and improve trial efficiencies. They allow for measurement in challenging populations such as neonates or patients with dementia. They may allow measurement of rare events which are difficult to capture, such as arrhythmias, seizures, and apneic spells. They allow for the measurement of new clinical characteristics such as stamina, gait stability, and tremor. They also provide a more convenient or precise way to measure existing features such as sleep, exercise, or blood pressure. Here's another challenge question. Justification of an endpoint as clinically meaningful depends on the type of DHT used in a clinical investigation. True or false? This is false. Justification of an endpoint is independent of the DHT used. Trials in the clinical practice setting. The opportunity to use existing clinical infrastructure, particularly when supported by interoperable data system, has become an area of increasing interest. The recovery trial in the UK for COVID-19 reportedly recruited 40,000 COVID patients through the National Health System in the UK within 6 weeks. They were able to show the mortality benefits of steroids in treating patients hospitalized with COVID. Practice settings allow engagement of large numbers of patients in short periods of time. They reflect the effectiveness of treatment in real-world environments and the accessibility of clinical trials to patients who wouldn't normally participate. FDA is committed to modernize clinical trials, incorporate technological and scientific advances, and potentially address the enormous costs and burden of drug development. There's interest from Congress, industry, and others in the community to enhance the efficiencies in drug development. There's interest of new stakeholders, engineers, DHT manufacturers to support clinical trials, and patients are seeking more convenient ways to participate in research. Congress also passed several pieces of legislation in the last year to modernize clinical trials. They passed the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and this includes a specific section on enhancing the use of digital health technologies to support drug development and review. And at the end of last year, they passed the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, which includes specific sections on decentralized clinical studies and modernizing clinical trials, and both of these have guidance requirements associated with them. The PDUFA VII DHT commitments include developing a framework, establishing a DHT steering committee, convening public meetings, identifying and funding demonstration projects, developing guidance, expanding review capabilities, and enhancing IT capabilities to review DHT-generated data and submissions. FDA published the framework for the use of digital health technologies in drug and biological product development in March of this year. FDA published a draft guidance on Part 11 earlier this year. This is Electronic Systems, Electronic Records, and Electronic Signatures in Clinical Investigations, Questions and Answers. FDA held the first of its public workshops in March of this year on understanding priorities for the use of digital health technologies to support clinical trials for drug development and review. CDER has a new webpage, DHTs for Drug Development. This webpage will highlight all of the work we are doing to meet our PDUFA commitments. One PDUFA commitment is to track submissions containing DHT-derived data. To do this, we recently updated Forms 1571 and 356H. Next time you complete these forms, please be sure to check the box Yes if your submission contains digital health technology data. Modern clinical trials provide opportunities to improve trial efficiencies, convenience for patients, access to diverse participants, and participants with rare diseases, to broaden how we conduct clinical trials, to collaborate with many different stakeholders, and to facilitate drug development. Engaging with the FDA. If you have plans to conduct a DCT or use a DHT in a clinical investigation, please reach out early in the development phase. If you have a specific drug you are developing, contact the appropriate therapeutic review division and request a representative from the DHT steering committee participate in any discussions. If you are considering a DHT or DCT not associated with a specific drug development program and would like to discuss general feasibility, please reach out to DHTs for Drug Development at fda.hhs.gov. Thank you. Now, Captain Kim Smith will discuss real-world evidence. At the conclusion of her presentation, we will both be available to answer any questions. Thank you.
My name is Kim Smith. I'm with the Real-World Evidence Analytics team in CDER's Office of Medical Policy, and I'm happy to be here with you today to discuss the real-world evidence provisions under PDUFA VII. The objectives of today's talk are to describe the FDA's real-world evidence program for drugs and biologics, to understand FDA's approach to evaluating real-world evidence for effectiveness, and to discuss FDA initiatives related to real-world evidence, including new commitments under PDUFA VII. So to start with a little bit of background on the U.S. effectiveness standard, it's grounded in law with the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act of 1962, which states that a drug's effectiveness must be established by substantial evidence consisting of adequate and well-controlled investigations. That's generally been interpreted as calling for 2 adequate and well-controlled trials. With the Food and Drug Modernization Act of 1997, substantial evidence could also be met by a single trial plus confirmatory evidence, which gives some flexibility in the evidence needed to support effectiveness claims. This is further laid out in regulation with 21 CFR 314.126 describing the characteristics of adequate and well-controlled studies to support claims of effectiveness for new drugs, and in guidance with a draft guidance published in 2019 on demonstrating substantial evidence of effectiveness for human drugs and biological products. So this is the background on which we're building the real-world evidence program for drugs and biological products, because our effectiveness standard has not changed. So fast forward to a time when the healthcare system is generating large volumes of clinical care data that could potentially be harnessed to inform our regulatory decision-making. Now, this is nothing new. FDA has a long history of using real-world data to monitor and evaluate the safety of approved drugs in the post-marketing setting. Once we get out of the clinical trial setting, we have a lot more patients taking the drugs for a lot longer time, and we can sometimes detect safety signals that you wouldn't ordinarily see in a clinical trial setting or a study setting. And so we have always used these types of data to inform our understanding of the safety profile of drugs. We have also used real-world data and real-world evidence to support product effectiveness, but at a really more limited basis. It's often that our decisions have been based on a more traditional clinical trial paradigm. That said, we now have a lot more data than we used to, and also some advances in the analyses of real-world data. And so this is leading to increased interest in the potential use of such data to support regulatory decisions in areas where we typically hadn't focused in the past. So in 2016, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act, which was designed to accelerate medical product development and bring new innovations faster and more efficiently to patients. It included some provisions related to real-world evidence. And in response, the FDA established a program to evaluate the use of real-world evidence to support new indications for a drug or to satisfy post-approval study requirements. The agency issued a draft framework in 2018, which describes sources of real-world evidence, as well as opportunities and challenges in the use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. The agency, as follow-up to issuance of the framework, issued multiple draft guidances between 2021 and 2022. And underlying all of this, as I said a couple slides back, our effectiveness standard remains unchanged. So the task before us is really to understand when can real-world data and real-world evidence actually meet our effectiveness standard and be used to support a new indication for a drug or to meet post-approval study requirements. So here's just a screenshot of the cover of FDA's Framework for Real-World Evidence, and there is a link down below if you're interested in learning more. The framework applies to the Center for Drugs, CDER, the Center for Biologics, CBER, as well as the Oncology Center of Excellence, OCE. CDER, of note, has their own real-world evidence program just because their regulatory framework for devices differs somewhat from that of drugs and biologics. The framework provides a multifaceted program to implement real-world evidence, including internal processes within the agency, engagement of external stakeholders, the development of guidances, as well as demonstration projects. The framework is grounded in two key definitions, and I'll use these terms a lot in this presentation, so just to be clear from the outset on what I'm referring to. Real-world data are data relating to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare that are routinely collected from a variety of sources. Real-world evidence is clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analyses of real-world data. To continue with terminology a bit more, we have interventional studies, which is what we've traditionally called clinical trials. In interventional studies, patients are assigned to the treatment or the intervention by a study protocol. This is in contrast with non-interventional studies, often called observational studies, in which patients receive the treatment of interest during routine medical care. It's a treatment that was prescribed by their medical provider. This is not a dichotomy necessarily, so studies can have components of both. So for example, you can have an externally controlled trial where the interventional treatment arm was determined by a study protocol, for instance, a single arm trial, and the outcomes in those patients are compared with patients who received a different treatment through routine medical care. So the control arm is a non-interventional or observational group. There is a spectrum of reliance on RWD in studies. It's not necessarily all or none. So on the left in this table, you have the traditional randomized trial where you may use real-world data in the planning of the trial, for instance, to assess feasibility, determine appropriate enrollment criteria, maybe select trial sites, but all of the other data from the trial are collected through trial sources, central labs and electronic case report forms and so on. On the far right, the opposite end of the spectrum would be a completely non-interventional or observational study. So this is where patients are getting routine medical care with treatments prescribed by their medical provider, and data is collected as part of routine care. Whatever labs the provider is ordering is being collected in electronic health records or maybe claims data. There is an area in the middle, though, where there may be components of a traditional randomized trial, but some of the data for the trial are collected through routine care practices. So maybe you're randomizing a patient to treatment, but then following that patient through data collected routinely and gleaned from the medical record. Or, as I mentioned on the last slide, an externally controlled trial where there are components of both an interventional and a non-interventional treatment groups. So the framework also lays out how the agency assesses real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. And the three buckets in terms of key considerations are the real-world data. Are they fit for use? Is the study design appropriate? And then is the study conducted in accord with regulatory requirements? We'll go into each of these in a little more detail in subsequent slides. So to start with data. So whether the real-world data are fit for use, there are really two major components of that. Reliability, meaning are the data accurate? Are they complete? Are they traceable? Can we link them back to an actual measure with an actual patient so that we can have confidence that the data that we have are real data? And then relevance. Are the data that you have relevant to the question of interest? So do you have the data elements you need to answer the question? And are the patients representative of patients who will use the drug? And do you have sufficient numbers of those patients to draw conclusions from the data? We have several draft guidances that have published that deal with data considerations. So key sources of real-world data are electronic health records and medical claims. There is a guidance that was published in September of 2021 on assessing EHRs and medical claims data to support regulatory decision-making. Registries are another common source of real-world data. So we have published a guidance in November 2021 assessing registries to support regulatory decision-making for drugs and biological products. And then finally, not specifically related to a data source, but how those data are handled and submitted to the agency, because there are requirements for adherence to certain data standards. And so there's another guidance that was published in October 2021 that addresses data standards for drugs and biological product submissions that contain real-world data. So won't go into detail on all of these, but readily accessible on the web if you're interested in what we say about each of these topics. Moving on to another key consideration when evaluating real-world data and real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making, and that's the study design. So we need to have confidence that the trial or the study design can provide adequate scientific evidence to help answer the regulatory questions. So can the study as designed meet requirements for the intent of the study? If it's for an effectiveness claim, would it meet the requirements for the US effectiveness standard? And so we do have one guidance that has been published in this space to date, and that is on considerations for the design and conduct of externally controlled trials for drugs and biological products that was published in February of 2023. And as noted on CDER's 2023 guidance agenda, we have two additional guidances that are in development. So one is on considerations regarding non-interventional studies for drugs and biological products, and another on using clinical practice data and randomized controlled trials. So stay tuned for both of those guidances. And then finally, in terms of the three key considerations, here are the regulatory considerations. So does the study conduct meet FDA regulatory requirements to support a decision, a regulatory decision? And so here, key is protection of human subjects. So in situations where you may need to get informed consent for the study and to protect data from human subjects. Being transparent about the study design and the study conduct, pre-specifying how the study is going to be conducted and analyzed. Access to data by FDA, so patient-level data to allow us to explore the data, understand the nature of the data, and conduct any additional analyses we need to understand the findings of the study. And then finally, study monitoring, so ensuring that the study is being conducted in accordance with the protocol and to meet the requirements from a regulatory perspective. So there is a draft guidance on all of these considerations. It's called the Considerations for the Use of Real-World Data and Real-World Evidence to Support Regulatory Decision-Making, and that one was published in December of 2021. A couple excerpts from the regulatory considerations guidance I think are important to highlight. So the first is that regardless of a study's interventional or non-interventional design, the evidence submitted by a sponsor in a marketing application to support safety or effectiveness must satisfy the applicable legal standards for the application to be approved or licensed. And there are a lot of considerations with non-interventional studies that differ somewhat from interventional studies. And so it's really important in this space for sponsors to engage with the agency in the early stages of designing a non-interventional study that's intended to support a marketing application. So shifting gears a bit from the 21st century cures provisions to PDUFA VII, which will cover fiscal years 2023 to 2027. We have 4 real-world evidence provisions under PDUFA VII. At the top, FDA will establish an advancing real-world evidence program, will report aggregate data on an annual basis describing RWE submissions to CDER and CBER. The third is we'll convene a public workshop or meeting to discuss RWE that meets regulatory requirements. And then finally, we will use lessons learned in this process to update existing or to generate new guidance documents in the RWE space. So to start with the top, we were directed to establish a real-world evidence program to identify approaches for RWE that meet regulatory requirements. The program is also intended to develop agency processes that promote consistent decision-making, and finally, to increase awareness of real-world evidence characteristics that support regulatory decisions. So the Advancing Real-World Evidence Program, on the left you'll see a screenshot from our website, and the link is below in case you'd like to get additional information. This is a program that was announced on October 20th, 2022. It allows for up to 4 meetings with sponsors and the agency to discuss the use of real-world evidence in medical product development. It is an optional program. All of the usual opportunities to meet with the agency through established meeting pathways remain available, but this is a new opportunity to have some of these more focused discussions on the use of RWE. So the goals of the program are to identify approaches for generating RWE that meet regulatory requirements, to develop agency processes related to the review of real-world evidence proposals, and to promote awareness of real-world evidence that can support regulatory decisions. As you'll see, one of the components of the program is a disclosure agreement between the sponsors and the agency that allow the agency to discuss the work under this program in a public forum to promote that awareness. So to be eligible for the program, sponsors must have an IND or a pre-IND for a specific product and indication. This is not intended to discuss sort of more general considerations related to real-world evidence and real-world data. The real-world evidence proposed must be intended to meet regulatory requirements in support of either labeling for effectiveness, such as new indications, populations, or dosing informations, or be intended to meet post-approval study requirements. And there needs to be agreement on the information that the agency can publicly disclose related to the proposal and the discussions. So the submission deadlines are twice per year, March 31st and September 30th, and that continues through the March 31st, 2027 deadline at the end of PDUFA VII. The initial request is a 12-page summary of the proposal. If you're interested in what that should contain, all of it is on the public website. For each cycle, FDA will review all proposals received in the preceding 6-month cycle and will accept 1 to 2 initial requests in the first 2 fiscal years, so FY 23 and 24, and 1 to 4 requests in FY 25 to 27. That decision will be based on, first and foremost, the scientific merits of the proposal, but also, given that this is a program intended to encourage learning and exploration about potential uses of real-world evidence, it will also take into account diversity of data sources, study designs, methods, as well as regulatory indications. Sponsors will be notified whether their initial meeting request of the program is accepted within 45 days of the deadline. So here's just a visual representation of that cycle. So on the left, you see that the sponsor submits the initial meeting request on day 0, which is either March 31st or September 30th. The agency has 45 days to evaluate the requests, and by day 45, we'll notify all sponsors of whether they're accepted or they're not accepted. And the acceptance is pending reaching agreement on those disclosures. And then by day 75, we'll have the first Advancing RWE program meeting. Sponsors can take information gained from the discussion and can determine whether follow-up meetings would be of benefit. And if so, at their discretion, they can request up to 3 additional meetings through the program. And if granted, those meetings will occur within 45 days of the follow-up meeting request. So as I mentioned, once we notify a sponsor that they've been tentatively selected to participate, we need to reach agreement on disclosures in terms of what design elements the FDA may present publicly as case studies. And once we have a signed agreement letter, we move forward with that initial program meeting. So the second provision under PDUFA VII related to real-world evidence was that by June 30th of 2024, the FDA is to report aggregate data on an annual basis describing submissions to CDER and CBER, including data sources, study designs, and types of regulatory requests. So more to come on that starting in 2024, but at this time, I just want to call your attention to a final guidance published in September of 2022 on submitting documents with real-world data, real-world evidence to the agency, which requests that when you submit these documents, that you include in your cover letter certain information that will allow us to identify that the submission includes RWD, RWE. So in the guidance at the link at the bottom, you'll see an example table that goes through different categories, the purpose of using the real-world data, real-world evidence, the study designs that you're proposing to employ, as well as the real-world data sources that you're proposing to use with your submission. The third provision under PDUFA VII is that by December 31st, 2025, the agency will convene a public workshop or meeting to discuss case studies. And that'll be focused on how to generate real-world evidence to meet regulatory requirements. So more to come in a couple of years on that. And then finally, I mentioned several guidances that we've published and more to come. The FDA will use the lessons learned from the Advancing Real-World Evidence Program and the other work under PDUFA VII to update existing guidances, to generate new guidances as needed, and that work will occur by December 31st of 2026. So to summarize, there's a lot of work being done in this space. The FDA's Real-World Evidence Program is advancing as was described in the 2018 framework. Real-world evidence presents some new challenges with regards to data, to study design, as well as to regulatory conduct of these studies. To try to move this field forward and to explain our thinking in certain areas, FDA has issued multiple guidances intended to inform the use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. And we have several new initiatives underway that aim to identify and promote awareness of real-world evidence-based approaches that meet regulatory requirements with several new provisions under PDUFA VII. So moving on to our first challenge question for this talk. The 21st Century Cures Act changed the effectiveness standard for new drug approvals to allow for approvals to be based on real-world evidence. So is this true or false? Just think about your answer to this question. So this one is false. Hopefully you got that one correct. The 21st Century Cures Act did not change the effectiveness standard. It just directed the agency to develop a real-world evidence program and begin to explore how real-world data and real-world evidence could be used to support regulatory decision-making. Challenge question number 2. Which of the following statements is not true? A, real-world evidence can arise from both interventional and non-interventional studies. The use of real-world data to understand trial feasibility is considered real-world evidence. Determining whether data are fit for use includes consideration of reliability and relevance. Or it is important to engage FDA early when considering use of a non-interventional study to support a marketing application. Which of these is not correct? All right, hopefully you got B. The use of real-world data to understand trial feasibility is considered real-world evidence. Sometimes we hear it described in this way, but really the types of explorations that are done to understand trial design we don't consider to be real-world evidence. That's sort of traditional uses of real-world data, but real-world evidence is really understanding the benefits and risks of products through analyses of real-world data. So if you're interested in more information on any of the topics I discussed, there were links, I think, throughout the presentation to the various guidances, the framework, publications. So that is a good place to start. We also have an email address for questions that's shown here on the screen. And feel free to reach out if you have specific questions. We can help to direct you further. So thank you very much for your time, and we will be available soon to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you both for those very informative presentations. We will roll right into our panel session. So for the audience, if you have not had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, this is your chance to get your questions answered, so please do so now. We will try to answer as many questions as time allows. So it looks like we have some questions that have already come in. For Ms. Kunkoski, we'll do yours first, a few questions for you. The first question is, have applications been accepted into the Advancing Real-World Evidence program? What advice could be provided to support a successful application?
Yes, and this is Kim Smith. I'll take this one. Thank you for the question. So we did just pass our first deadline on March 31st for submissions to the program for initial meetings, and we have completed our evaluation process and have selected initial programs to participate. More to come on that once we've had the discussions and have some learnings to share with the group more broadly. In terms of advice for a successful application, I think start with the externally facing program website, which goes through in detail the information we would like to see in the initial meeting proposal. And make sure you adhere to the format and content guidelines, as well as sharing the information requested in as clear and succinct a manner as possible. I think that is an excellent starting point. It allows us to carefully evaluate each proposal and determine which to select for each cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Smith. Since we have you, let's give you one more question. Would the use of real-world data, such as an external control arm, clinical trial, be used only for critical or rare conditions? Are there limitations on the types of indications being studied?
Yes, thank you for the question. So we don't have sort of specified limitations on situations where we would be willing to accept real-world evidence to support a regulatory decision. So I think at this point, it's really on a case-by-case basis through early discussions with the agency. You know, things that we do consider are situations where there is unmet need, where it may not be feasible or practical to conduct a different type of a study. I think we all recognize that there can be some limitations in the use of real-world data and real-world evidence. And so generally, we're looking for situations where the uncertainty that may result could be minimized, and also it would be reasonable to accept the level of uncertainty that may result from the use of a real-world evidence study to support the decision. So sometimes that is in situations where it is a severe or rare disease and it's challenging to conduct other types of studies. But we are certainly open to proposals in other areas and evaluate them on a case-by-case basis based on the criteria that I shared earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Smith. Another question for you. Why would a sponsor pursue a meeting through the Advancing Real-World Evidence program rather than through another meeting pathway?
Yes, thank you. So I think the advantage of the Advancing Real-World Evidence program is this really is a focused pathway to discuss proposals involving real-world evidence. So, we have a team that's been convened to evaluate these proposals and to discuss these proposals with sponsors that really has expertise from across the agency in the use of real-world data and real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. So we know that there are issues that we need to work through. Some aspects of the use of these types of data in studies differ from our more traditional trial paradigms. And so this is really an opportunity to discuss in the context of a specific development program many of those issues with the right people in the room. It also allows for some iterative interactions on a more quick time frame than some of the other meeting pathways would allow, because the program allows for up to 4 meetings on the proposal, with follow-up meetings being held within 45 days of the request. So I think the hope is that the program will allow for, number one, an all-hands-on-deck approach with all the right people in the room to address the issues raised by a proposal, and also to be able to do so in an iterative fashion through multiple interactions over a relatively short period of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Smith. So now let's move on to Ms. Kunkoski. So your first question, do the decentralized locations need to be listed on the 1572, or is it only the main site?
Thank you for that question. I think that's the golden question when it comes to a 1572 and decentralized clinical trials. So the guidance discusses that for inspectional purposes, there should be a physical location where all clinical trial related records for participants under the investigator's care are accessible and where trial personnel can be interviewed. This location should be listed on the Form 1572, or for IDE applications, they must be included in the IDE application. And I think some of the other questions that we're going to get into now talk a little bit more about how you make that distinction in a decentralized trial.
Thank you. Another question for you. Are there examples of decentralized clinical trials where an investigational drug, a drug that has not been approved for any indication, is shipped directly to participants' homes?
So the specifics of what has or has not been approved in an IND are generally confidential in nature, so I can't discuss that specifically, but I can talk a little bit to, in the guidance, it talks a lot about more of the risk-based approach of how to decide if a DCT is appropriate for whatever drug you're studying. So some of those lower risk drugs that a patient can administer on their own and is not likely to have a serious adverse effect would be appropriate for shipping directly to a patient's home. Again, that's discussed a little more detail in the draft DCT guidance that is out right now.
Thank you. Let's take one more question for you. We have one here. Would local healthcare providers need to be listed on the 1572 as sub-investigators?
Thank you. So no, local healthcare providers can be listed on what we are considering the task log that is kept by the investigator, and that is just a running list of any local healthcare providers, their name, licensing, affiliation, where they're located, and then it would be a running list of the activities and the dates and times that those local healthcare providers conduct as part of the clinical investigation.
Thank you. Let's move back to Captain Smith with a few more questions. Captain Smith, when is it appropriate to use real-world evidence to support a regulatory decision?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to note that RWE can involve various study designs. So I think we're often thinking of non-interventional or purely observational studies, but this can also involve single-arm trials with comparator arms from real-world data. It can also involve randomization, where you're randomizing patients to an intervention of interest but then you're collecting their outcomes using real-world data. So, for instance, you're following electronic health records or medical claims data to assess what happens to the patients following their randomization to a particular treatment. So, I think it's important to understand that real-world evidence is a fairly broad construct. Regardless of the type of study design, however, as I mentioned, our substantial evidence standard remains the same, and so we really need to think through situations where we can minimize the uncertainty involved, and we can have a clear sense that the drug is producing the effect that we're proving it to produce, if you will. So I think it's again on a case-by-case basis, but really understanding the data sources, the study design, as well as the regulatory conduct, so that we can have confidence that the results of the study warrant the regulatory decision that we're making. Thank you.
Thanks, Captain Smith. We have another question that came in for you. Is the agency looking for particular types of study proposals for the Advancing Real-World Evidence Program?
Thank you. No, not necessarily. So we are looking for proposals that are linked to a specific drug for a specific indication. So not a proposal, for instance, just to address some general concept in the real-world evidence space. We really want to be talking about a specific idea that would support a new indication or meet a post-approval study requirement for a drug. And beyond that, we're going to be looking, as I had mentioned, at the scientific merits of the proposal. Are the proposed data sources likely to be appropriate? Is the study design likely to be adequate to answer the question? And then is the sponsor going to be able to conduct the study in a way that would meet our regulatory requirements? Initially, we have you can cast a fairly broad net. Over time, we're going to be looking for ideas that may be more novel because we do want to have a breadth of experiences through the program in terms of different indications, different types of methods, data sources, etc. So no, beyond a specific drug and a specific indication, where we don't have additional criteria at this time that would narrow the types of submissions that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving back to Ms. Kunkoski. There need to be an agency review of protocol-specific definitions of healthcare professional activities to verify that the healthcare professional is the appropriate designation versus sub-investigator.
Thank you. I'll start with the broader picture of making that distinction of the sub-investigator versus a local healthcare provider. And there is a guidance that has been out there for some time on, it's called the Information Sheet Guidance for Sponsors, Clinical Investigators, and IRBs Frequently Asked Questions, Statement of the Investigator, or Form FDA 1572, and this was updated in May of 2021. And this really talks about the distinction between the investigator and the sub-investigator. And now that we've come out with the Decentralized Clinical Trials Guidance, we break that down a little farther. Section 3D2 is the investigator roles in that guidance. And there it talks about how local healthcare professionals are contracted to provide trial-related services that are part of routine clinical practice. For example, performing physical examinations, reading radiographs, obtaining vital signs, and where a detailed knowledge of the protocol, investigational product, and the investigator brochure is not necessary. These should not be listed on the 1572 as sub-investigators. And so this is always a challenging distinction of where do you draw the line. And so this is where your question is perfect of, yes, of course, we would love to have this discussion with you. Come talk to the agency early when you're planning your decentralized clinical trial. Tell us what your proposal is and why. But we really are hoping that we can start to rely more on some of these local healthcare providers, but that oversight is still the responsibility of the investigator for the trial. So we're happy to have that discussion with you early on as you are designing your DCT. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question for you. What are the most significant barriers to DCT adoption?
So as I was just alluding to, that balance between the investigator and the sub-investigator and the local healthcare provider, we have certainly heard from many sponsors and investigators that it's been a challenge to figure out that role, and also particularly what an investigator is actually comfortable with in delegating and not overseeing day to day, because on a piece of paper they are still legally responsible. So that is definitely one area we've heard a lot of concerns. Also from the planning and logistics aspect of a DCT, as one of the questions was about shipping investigational products. All of those things, there need to be significant planning to successfully carry that out for a large-scale clinical trial. There has to be a lot of training for the trial personnel. Sometimes contract study nurses are used. Those still need to be trained on what the responsibilities are associated with the trial. There needs to be the training with the participants. If a participant is using a digital health technology, they have to be trained on how to ensure all of that data is appropriately captured for the trial. And so all of these things all have costs associated with them, so that can increase some of the upfront costs with running a decentralized clinical trial. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do one more question for you. If a patient's digital health technology is used, what consideration should be given to source data being available for monitoring or future auditing by the FDA?
Thank you. So the Digital Health Technologies Guidance has a section on record retention and retention, and also there is now the new Part 11 electronic systems guidance that came out earlier this year, and both of those speak to source data in the digital health technology. We recognize that it is not realistic for the source data to be stored on the digital health technology, so we are considering, once that data is transferred from the digital health technology to the sponsor's data repository, that data repository that the sponsor has responsibility for is considered the source data, and so that is what would be inspected if there were a FDA inspection. Thank you.
Okay, let's move back to Captain Smith. Captain Smith, here's a question for you. To generate real-world data to evaluate the drug for a particular indication, should the drug be approved through regular pathways to approve its safety and effectiveness?
Yes, thank you. So I assume the question is asking, for a sponsor to use real-world evidence to support a new indication, should the product already have been approved using more traditional study designs, such as a randomized trial, and have some existing safety and effectiveness data. So should this be for drugs that are already marketed in the US? I think, again, there are no absolutes in this space, but in general, for products who have already been marketed in the US and there may be some off-label use for different indications, that's a situation where it may make sense to consider the use of real-world evidence, because you will have existing US data, and so less questions about whether data, for instance, from other countries is applicable to the US population and practice of medicine. And potentially you would have a breadth of experience on which to base determination of efficacy and safety for a new indication. So that would be an area where it may make sense to pursue these types of discussions moving forward. But again, this is a fairly new area, and there's growing interest with all of the data that are now out there. So we are open to discussions of other types of proposals, depending on the disease area and the study design and the available data sources. Thank you.
Thanks. We have another question for you. How do the PDUFA VII real-world evidence initiatives relate to the broader real-world evidence efforts already underway?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I really view the PDUFA VII commitments and initiatives as a progression. And so it's a way for us to begin to engage more in specific areas where we know, based on the guidances we publish, that there are a lot of questions. And we need to learn through interactions and through case studies how to move this area forward. And so through the Advancing Real World Evidence program, we'll gain experience with specific sponsors and specific proposals. That information and those lessons learned, we'll be able to discuss publicly with others who are interested in this space through the disclosure agreements and future discussions of case studies publicly. And then as we learn more and gain experience in this area, we can feed that back into our guidances with either revised or new guidances, as well as public meetings in the future. So I think all of this is just moving us towards gaining experience, learning, and then using those learnings to feed back into the guidance that we're providing in the future. Thank you.
Thanks. And one more question for you. What happens after sponsors participate in the Advancing Real World?
Yes, thank you. So, as I mentioned, based on one of the other earlier questions, the up to 4 meetings through the Advancing Real World Evidence program are really intended to, provide sponsors with iterative feedback on proposals and try to work through any issues and challenges that may be presented by the use of real-world evidence to support an indication or to meet a post-approval study requirement. And at the end of those interactions, the goal is really to have a generally agreed upon plan. And then, the sponsor, as with any other development program plan, will continue on with the usual pathways for interactions with the review division and with the agency. So maybe that the next step is to submit a formal protocol to the review division for any additional feedback before implementing the study, or if needed, to engage in additional discussions of the proposal. So, this is a program that allows for a large group of folks with expertise to come together with the review divisions and provide input on issues. But if at any point the sponsor is ready to go back to the usual processes, those are always available. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Smith. It looks like we have a few more minutes, so we will go back to Ms. Kunkoski. This is kind of a longer question, but when using is currently on the market with 510(k) clearance as validated measures for evaluating a drug on trial, and later a recall or a device alert occurs for the device used for the investigation, is the suggestion to perform a risk assessment and provide a rationalization for accepting the outcome, then list the limitation or potential variation in the validation device as part of the submission?
Thank you. This is a fairly specific question, but I think it's a best practice for anything that comes up unanticipated in your clinical trial is come talk to the agency. If your method of collecting data in your trial is recalled or there's an alert for it, you're putting your entire study at jeopardy. So I would certainly recommend approaching the review division as soon as you find out this information. Your approach sounds very reasonable of performing a risk assessment and then addressing how those changes or risks are being addressed in your clinical investigation. But really, I can't encourage you enough for many of these different aspects of modernizing clinical trials. Come talk to the agency early and we'll talk through it with you, and that way we can both ensure the validity of the data that you're collecting through your study. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we have time for maybe one more question. For a digital, if it were considered significant risk, is there a guidance or regulation that points to allowing the information required for an IDE to be placed in an IND? Additionally, where would the documentation be placed in the IND? Does this apply to all review divisions?
Thank you. That is something that I did address in my presentation earlier this morning, that yes, we do foresee that most significant risk devices can be reviewed as part of the IND. This also is addressed in the digital health technology guidance that is out in draft right now. That is something we did receive many docket comments on, so we are revising that section to make it a little more robust and making it a little clearer for the different buckets of device regulation and digital health technologies. I would encourage you to include that information within your IND. This is where the cover letter is very important to include in your cover letter that your IND includes a digital health technology. It's considered significant risk. The device aspects of that are that would normally be included in the IDE are actually included in the IND, and just outline in your cover letter table of contents where all of that documentation is actually included. But you are right, the transparency and explaining that up front will really go a long way to facilitate the review process of both centers. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have for questions right now. Thank you for all those great questions and the presenters for those excellent responses and the presentations. So let us now, we will break and we will return at, is it, let me check, 12:45 from lunch. So